Welcome back to 101 East. To discuss the impact of 1989's protests on China today, I'm joined from Beijing by Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies and a translator for the former Premier Deng Xiaoping. And in Singapore, foreign policy expert and author Dr. John Lee from the Center for Independent Studies. Thanks both for joining us today. Victor Gao, let me begin with you, if I might. Was June the 4th, 1989 just one day in history, or has it had a lasting presence in China?
Well, the Beijing incident in 1989 was a major event, and it actually changed the course of development in China.
How so?
It is an important event, and it will never be forgotten. However, I think for us as a nation in China, the more important thing right now is to learn lessons from the Beijing incident and to figure out what's the best course going forward.
All right, we'll talk about that in just a second, Victor, if I can stop you there for a second.
By the incident.
What has its impact been? You said it's had an impact.
Well, first of all, it changed the leadership in China, because originally before the Beijing incident, there was a group of leaders who were already on the short list. Mr. Zhao Ziyang was the general secretary at that time, etc. But as a result of the Beijing incident, you had a new group of people, promoted to the very top leadership in China. Of course, this had a major impact on the development in China over the past 20 years. Yes.
All right, that's fairly significant. John Lee, let me put that to you. A change in attitude, if not a fundamental change in the way the Communist Party is actually run. Do you see that? And what changes do you think otherwise occurred as a consequence?
Well, I think the changes have been pretty profound. The changes have largely occurred in terms of what the party sought to achieve in terms of pre-Tiananmen and post-Tiananmen. In a pre-Tiananmen period, you actually had the rise of a fairly independent economic class. And this was seen as a positive development in many parts of the world. After Tiananmen, the party retook power, but not just political power, the party actually retook economic power. And let me just cite one very quick statistic to demonstrate that. Prior to Tiananmen, so from 1978 to 1988, around 3/4 of the country's capital and economic resources were going to private industries. After Tiananmen, you had a very deliberate policy shift, and the reverse occurred. Now 3/4 of the country's capital are destined for state-controlled industries. So it was an attempt to retake not just political power, but economic power. So and in that sense, the Chinese Communist Party has been very, very successful.
So this was a negative development in your mind?
Well, on the one hand, it has propelled China to very impressive growth. But on the other hand, it has actually come at the expense of the vast majority of the country. I think you spoke about a middle class earlier, the 100, 200 million people in China. In a technical sense, it's not a middle class as such, it's a privileged classes. You still have around 1 billion people in China who are largely missing out on the fruits of successful growth. And this has largely been a result of the state-led policy in China.
It's interesting that you're framing your conversation here in terms of economic impacts rather than social, cultural, freedom of speech impacts that most other people would consider to be the legacy of Tiananmen. And also that you're suggesting that somehow the economic growth has been inadequate in China. Most people wouldn't look at it in that way, would they?
I don't think it's been inadequate in the sense that the growth has been impressive, but it's been unbalanced. What you see in China is structural inequality, and that tends to happen when you have a state-led model development. Now, this actually wasn't the case prior to Tiananmen. You had a vibrant private sector rising up in Tiananmen, prior to Tiananmen. So I focus on the economics because it was a deliberate party policy to reassert its control in Chinese economy in order to remain in power.
Let me put that to Victor then. The change of leadership was in fact not the most significant thing, but the wresting of state economic power back into the hands of the Communist Party, according to John. How do you respond to that?
Well, let me comment both on the economic aspect as well as on the political aspect. Economically speaking, the state-owned sector in China now only accounts for about 1/3 of the total economy. This is a big reduction from 20 years ago, and especially from 30 years ago. And also, in China, for the 1.3 billion people, it is absolutely the case that most likely for the most majority, people's livelihood today is much, much better off than 20 years ago. There is no denying about that. You know, talking about the structural difference, etc., there is no denying that the economic situation in China today is much better than 20 years ago.
Let me stop you there for a minute, Victor. I mean, it may be in pure bottom line numbers, but I think John's point was that the growth model has been unbalanced in a way that is much more problematic than the basic numbers would suggest.
Well, each country has problems, its economies. You know, China, despite of all the potential problems or structural defects, etc., has managed to achieve phenomenal economic growth over the past 20 years since the Beijing incident. Why? One crucial important ingredient is political stability in the country. Because without political stability, we would never be able to have gotten to today. So that's for the economy, and I think it's for the whole world to see. But politically speaking, I would also add, Chinese people today enjoy much greater political freedom and liberties compared with the situation 20 years ago. And even students in the Tiananmen Square 20 years ago probably would not dare to imagine that we today as a nation actually enjoy more democracy and human rights than 20 years ago.
Do you agree with that, John?
This is also a fact.
I don't think it's at all credible to say that people today in China enjoy more political freedoms than they did in the 1980s. But let me return to the economic point.
No, please, John.
Correct that the private sector in China.
John, could I keep you on the political one for a minute, because this is perhaps one where there is more energy, more complaint invested internationally than in the economic question. So you don't think there's any more freedom? Why not? What do you see that denies that?
Well, let me cite a few examples. In a lot of respects, the growing wealth of the Chinese economy and of the Chinese nation has actually allowed the Chinese Communist Party to entrench their power. And let me cite a few examples. If you look at the $800 million spent on the so-called Great Firewall of China, the internet surveillance sort of system. That's a system that employs 45,000 people to monitor the internet. Let me cite a few other examples. When you look at judicial reform in China, there has been no judicial reform in China. And in fact, the State Council a few months ago explicitly emphasized that the judicial system in China is to remain under control of the Chinese Communist Party.
Let me just ask you about this Great Firewall of China. It's a nice phrase, but do you think the US government spends any less money on policing the internet?
The US government spends money policing the internet, but they don't spend the money policing the internet for political reasons. They may do it for various reasons such as pornography or child pornography and so on. But it's not designed to actually filter out news coming from overseas. That's a critical difference.
Let's put that to Victor. I mean, there is an enormous amount of effort spent in China on preventing certain opinions from making it to the mainstream. You can't deny that, surely.
Let me add one point. In China, China now is the largest internet country in the whole world, as well as the largest mobile phone country in the world. We have more than 300 million internet users and almost 700 million mobile users. Now, it is an impossible mission for any government in the world to patrol the internet involving 300 million people and 600 or 700 million mobile phone users.
Victor, the point...
Of course, the government spent some time doing control of a certain context. There is no denying about that. And also on a more macro level, if you look at China as a snapshot, you can always come up with criticism or even condemnation about things in China. But if you look at China as a motion picture involving 20 years ago in a dynamic way all the way to today, then you have to conclude that there is greater democracy, greater human rights today compared with 20 years ago. Despite of all the defects in China, we are moving forward, and we as a nation want to move in the right direction. We want democracy, we want human rights, but we want to achieve these goals in a peaceful way, without violence, without massive demonstrations, without bloodshed anymore, by maintaining political stability. This is the crucial thing. Without this, China's economic achievements will be ruined.
Okay, Victor Gao, John Lee, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. And that's all we have time for this week. My thanks to my guests, and from all of us here on 101 East, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.